Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on when this finds you. Just want to talk a little bit today about a subject area I've been avoiding for quite a long time. And as I've told you before, I'm not through with the church. Uh, and like I said, the church has been very destructive in a lot of the things that they've promoted, a lot of things that they've taught, a lot of things they're still teaching. And the more I read these other Bibles that were kind of put in place that we don't have access to really anymore, the more I see how much deception has been put in our modern Bibles. And you've always heard me say, I still believe in the Bible. But for years, like many of you, I've always had questions about some of the things in the Bible. But I'm not here to, I'm going to share a few scriptures today, but more than anything, I'm going to talk about Christians again. Because what's worse than a wolf in sheep's clothing? You know, it's a wolf in shepherd's clothing. And so the information I'm going to share in this video is very troubling to me, and it should be troubling to a lot of you, especially if you identify as a Christian. You know, I remember reading a poem, something like it. I don't know what it was actually called some years back that was titled, That's What Christians Do Now. And many of you probably read that poem before. And I was talking to my granddaughter one day, and she has a very open relationship with me where we can talk. And she knows I won't judge her. She knows my wife won't judge her. We just listen, give advice. We say what we're going to say, and we move on. And one of the things my wife and I never do is we never tell a person what they should do. We always tell them, hey, the decision is yours. You follow what you think is right. I'm never going to tell you what you should do. And so I listen to her, and I'll present different perspectives. And one time we were talking about the Bible, and she said, you know, I don't like these Christian folks out there because they are the biggest hypocrites I've ever met. And, you know, based on a lot of things that have been done historically and the way many Christians act today, how can you argue with what she said? I mean, isn't it amazing how Christians always manage to talk about Muslims? But there is another group of people out there who have done much worse to people, especially Christians. And their religious book says to do violence to others as well. But Christians are always standing with them. The pastors are always talking from their pulpits to stand with them. So in reality, what Christians are saying is as long as it's approved Christian conservative violent, it's A-okay. You see, Christians always want to complain about Christians, other Christians being persecuted around the world. But the great majority of Christians have no clue what Christians have done long before they were born to other people. See, black folks question other blacks for joining the Mormon faith, but many blacks are members of the Catholic Church and of various Christian denominations. Now, do you some homework and look at what all of them have done to black folks. You know, as I've stated before, I do not identify as a Christian anymore. However, I do identify with the Bible. And I'm not perfect. I sin. I make mistakes. I fall down. But as the gospel singer Donnie McClurkin say, you know, we fall down, but we get back up again. But I identify with the Bible. I just don't identify with Christianity anymore. And sadly, the Bible and Christianity are nowhere near each other. Christianity is also a religion. You know, although we've been taught that the word Christian was first mentioned in the book of Acts, it's a lie too. See, Micah 4:11 says, many nations have come to fight against you. They say, look, there is Zion. Let's attack her. And what black folks have been doing for centuries are attacks from other nations. Lamentations 4:2 has this to say: the precious people of Zion were once worth more than gold, but now they are treated like something worthless, like the cheap clay jars a potter makes. The book of Jubilees, chapter 27, 1 and 2 says, and the words of Esau, her elder son, were told to Rebekah in a dream. And Rebekah sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said unto him, behold, Esau thy brother will take vengeance on thee so as to kill thee. Now, why did Esau hate Jacob so much? And that question can still be asked today. Why does Esau's descendants hate Jacob's descendant so much? Well, in the book of Jubilees, chapter 35, verse 12, it says this: and he is bitter against thee because thou didst bless Jacob, thy perfect and upright son. You know, Isaac actually called the two sons together and told them this. In the book of Jubilees, chapter 36, verse 9, it reads, and if either of you devises evil against his brother, know that from henceforth everyone that devises evil against his brother shall fall into his hand and shall be rooted out of the land of the living, and his seed shall be destroyed from under heaven. That's why. See, I know many men of the cloth who teach that we should not use the Apocrypha for any biblical teaching because it's not canon. Well, which people removed the Apocrypha from the original Bible in the first place? The same people that started seminaries. See, they didn't remove those books because they thought those books weren't important. They removed those books for two reasons and two reasons only. They wanted to hide who true Israel was, and they wanted to hide who the original Bible said they were. But what does the book of John say in chapter 21, verse 25? There are also many other things that Yahusha did. If all of them were to be written one by one, I suppose that not even the world itself will have room for the books being written. And you even have black preachers out here saying those books aren't valid. But who were many of these pastors taught by? As much as we talk about the Messiah, his presence in what is left, although great, is very limited. See, the information here is readily available for the person who wants to know. You know, for years we've heard about all the ills of Islam, but we gloss over and ignore the ills of Christianity. Every time we hear about the Middle East, we always hear about how Muslims did this, Muslims did that. Why don't we ever hear about what Christians have done? But we always hear about what is being done to the Jews. But we love to ignore everything done to black people. You know, I've researched this topic of lynching, and y'all saw the topic, the title of the video. I've researched this topic throughout the years and had decided I would never share these details. However, my spirit would no longer allow me to hold this information. And I guess, you know, maybe my spirit's speaking to me because, you know, the way we're headed, you know, in the book of Thessalonians, just say, you know, Christians are going to be under strong delusion. People are going to be under strong delusion. And so Yahuwah uses different people to help people come from under strong delusion. You might not like the people. You might not appreciate what the people are trying to share. But that don't stop Yahuwah from using them. But and my spirit just wouldn't allow me to hold this information any longer. And when the Father gives you an assignment, it's going to keep troubling you until you do it. It'll interrupt your sleep at night. It'll be on your mind when you're engaged in other things. And, you know, it's definitely on my mind right now as we encourage to stand with the people who don't believe what we as Bible believers believe, although we are constantly told they are God's chosen. So you may as well, you know, as I heard one guy say, you know, finish it off. You know, we keep wondering why, although things have gotten better, why haven't they gotten much better? There are some deep-rooted things that just have not been overcome. Although slavery ended, supposedly, blacks were still largely marginalized to still nothing more than third-class citizens because even animals were considered more precious than black human beings. The period after slavery was actually more brutal than slavery, although Gentile historians would never teach you that. Right today, many whites consider their pets more valuable than humans, especially black humans. Now, just reading back over this information almost brought tears to my eyes. And these notes have actually been in place for quite a while now, because at the time I was working on it, I had to work on it in spurts because I just couldn't deal with all of this stuff at one time, because it was just so much, and it was painful reading through all this stuff and looking at these pictures and all of that stuff. And I'm going to address some of what I'm talking about, you know, with the pictures and all of that stuff later on in this video as well. But it was just troubling. You know, this information was hard to stomach for me. So if you got a weak countenance, you know, this might not be a video for you to listen to. But if you want some truth, this will be the video for you. You know, for traditional white Christians, black skin was associated with evil. Now, the prevailing Christian view by the end of the Middle Ages was that non-Europeans were inferior creatures. You hear that? Creatures. They weren't even considered people. And see, the Roman Catholic Church debated for a long time whether newly discovered people around the world were even human. Roman Catholic Church. See, but what you need to know, Roman soldiers would not attack black-skinned humans centuries ago because they felt anyone with black skin was closest to God. You know, we call him God, but back then he was actually called Yah, and that's still his name. And I think I'm going to do a video on his name at some point and show you how he feels about us calling him God and not his name. But I'm not going to do that in this video, because it's right there in our Bibles and several scriptures about how he feels about his name. And God ain't his name. Who told us he was God and not Yahuwah? But let me not get off track. But, you know, I didn't make that up. Research for yourself about the soldiers and the black-skinned people, the Roman soldiers. You know, I understand, you know, why we got a picture of a white Messiah called Jesus. See, the problem with the Roman Catholic Church was that there was no way of establishing whether or not other people around the world possessed souls. Indigenous people of the Americas were a particular problem because they clearly had a high culture of their own, and the Roman Catholic Church debated it with itself for a long time over their exact nature. And see, long after public opinion had forced Christians to abandon the practice of slavery, the prevailing orthodoxy was that non-whites were inferior people spiritually, morally, and mentally. And, you know, we've heard that. I heard that stuff growing up about how black people brains are smaller than white people brains, and, you know, how we couldn't, you know, think on the same level as white people. I mean, I heard all that stuff growing up. And see, and then they use the Bible to cite, and, you know, to basically prove what they said was right. And in the book of Joshua, chapter 9, verse 21, it says, let them live, but let them be hewers of wood and drawers of water. See, the Bible is not a racist book, but it is a book about a specific people. And those people just happen to have colored skin. All your churches maintain systems of racial discrimination and sustain them well into the 20th century, including segregated churches and church schools. See, racial segregation was opposed largely by atheists, intellectuals, and other free thinkers. You know, one thing you can say about atheists, they stick together in their beliefs. We have over 4,000 religions in Christianity out of one Bible. But as far as I know, atheism only has one. See, it wasn't bishops, it wasn't clergymen, but it was unbelievers out there like Bertrand Russell, who spread the idea that all should be treated equally. You hear that? An unbeliever said that all people should be created equally. How can an idea that is supposedly Christian be ignored by Christians and practiced by infidels? Remember the video where I read some of the words from the socialist view on religion and churches? See, atheists, once again, saw what Christians were doing was wrong. Atheists treated blacks with fairness while white Christians kept their biases intact. What does that say about Christians and atheists? In 2013, Dr. James Cone spoke at Vanderbilt University. And he said, you can lynch a people by more than just hanging them on a tree. And he said, how long will this terror last? That was in 2013. See, blacks were lynched for various and absurd reasons. Some black people were lynched for throwing stones. They could, if they skipped a stone across a lake, they could get killed. They would, it could lead to death. I mean, if you were a boy and ever went to a pond or lake, you have thrown a stone to see if it would skip across the water and how far you could go. Heck, I've even seen some girls do that. There are cases on record that lynch mobs hung some black men because they were unpopular in the community. And yet, how many times have we seen these women that we call Karens nowadays, who are very popular, not popular, unpopular in communities all over this country, but you would never get away with lynching a white person, especially a white woman. These people literally got away with this behavior done to blacks. Some black people who were homeless and didn't hold regular employment or earned income were lynched. I know everyone who lives on the street did not choose to live there. How can a system that has been discriminatory, a system that has been discriminatory, punish the very people they oppressed in the first place? But that's just a rhetorical question, because a country that oppresses the people doesn't particularly care about their well-being. See, in many cases, blacks were murdered for injuring or killing livestock. That sounds to me like the animals' lives are more valuable. But that goes back to what I said earlier, what pets are considered more important than humans. Sadly, we continue to see people go to jail for killing a dog, but people continue to get a pass for killing black people. Cop can kill a human on accidental purpose and get a slap on the wrist. But if you kill a police dog, you're going to prison for killing a police officer. Although black men were allowed to vote in most states after 1870, many blacks were killed when they were caught trying to participate. And if they did vote and didn't vote to the others' liking, mobs of white men will kill them. They always took place if blacks tried to vote Republican. Now, it wasn't no Republican back during the 1700s, but, around that time, you had Democrats and Republicans. And see, your Democrats love black people so much that they will kill them for not voting for them. And Negroes still out here voting for these Negroes and white folks, They just can't put it in their heart to vote Republican. If you can't put it in your heart to vote Republican, stay at home. Because you ain't got nothing from your Democrats. Nothing. Some blacks were killed by mobs because they were accused of acting or looking suspicious around whites. Now think about that. Whites have been treating blacks horrible since they arrived here. So it's no surprise that blacks were suspicious in the presence of whites. And when I say when they arrived, I'm talking about whites because blacks were already here. Please don't come with any foolishness about that, because my girl Dana gonna check you. Trust me. In several cases, blacks were lynched because they demanded to be treated with respect. Can you believe that? If a black person desired respect, they would get lynched. But white men would beat and imprison a black man or woman for not showing them respect. Black person would have to cross the street if a white person approached on the same side of the street. Now, I'll tell you something. When you have to force respect, you are not worthy of respect. You are the lowest scum of the earth. You got low self-image. You got low self-esteem. You got low self-worth. if you got to force respect. So let me say that again, because a lot of people today still operate by that code, black, white, and every other color. If you have to force or demand respect, you are not worthy of respect. You command respect with character and integrity. You can't force something. Anytime you force something, it ain't going to work in your favor anyway long term. It might work short term. See, many black women, men, and children were murdered when they were caught practicing voodoo. Now, I'm not a fan of voodoo practices, but how can someone kill another for practicing something basically in private when the folks doing the murder are practicing evil openly? Many blacks were hung for being too loud in public or being deemed as disorderly. See, we're a vocal people. We're a harmonious people. But when whites got together back then for KKK rallies, they weren't quiet. Black people that were caught gambling during this time were lynched. Now, what do you think Wall Street is? It's a big gambling business. I read somewhere that paying a fine for something just means it's legal for a price. Psalms 55:3 says, "My enemies shout at me and threaten me. In their anger, they attack me. They bring troubles crashing down on me." Now listen to this story. C.J. Miller was falsely accused of killing 2 teenage white sisters in western Kentucky. He was dragged through the streets to a crude platform of old barrels, staves, and other kindling. You know, that's from Philip Dre. He's a historian. He wrote, "At the hands of persons unknown, the lynching of Black America." And Dre goes on to say his assailants hanged him from a telephone pole, and while the first fall broke his neck, the body was repeatedly raised and lowered while a crowd peppered it with small arms fire. For 2 hours, his corpse hung above the street, during which he was photographed and mutilated by onlookers. Finally, he was cut down and burned. More savage was the lynching of Mary Turner and her unborn child, killed for protesting her husband's murder. Before a crowd that included women and children, writes Dre, Mary was stripped, hung upside down by the ankles, soaked with gasoline, and roasted to death. In the midst of this torment, a white man opened her swollen belly with a hunting knife, and her infant fell to the ground, gave a cry, and was stomped to death. That's what Christians do. Now, there's not much I agree with on Obama when he was in office, but he made a statement that pissed Christians off, and I have to agree with it. At the annual National Prayer Breakfast one year, after condemning Islamic radical groups ISIS as a death toll, he stated, "Now, unless we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. So this is not unique to one group or one religion. There is a tendency in us, a sinful tendency, that can pervert and distort our faith." The Christians got mad at him for that. I didn't, because he told the truth. Now, make no mistake about it, I don't agree with much of what any president says, not just Obama. You know, like I don't know if I mentioned before, some time back, I was getting my wife's car serviced, and the same, I normally use the same shop, and so, the people that work there normally get the same guy who always works on the car, and the ladies that work the counter, I use the place so much, they'll buy me breakfast and lunch when I'm there. But they asked me one day, "Mr. Jones," because the topic in the lobby area where all the customers are waiting, lively conversation was going, and I wasn't engaging. I always take a book because I know when I go in, I might be a while, so I always take a book to read. And so I'm reading my book, and all the ladies and guys at the counter are engaging, and with the customers, and all of them are talking, and I'm just reading. And one of the ladies said, "Mr. Jones, Which president you like? I said, the White Eisenhower. And they said, Mr. Jones, were you even living with the White Eisenhower? I said, no. I said, but I think he might have been the last decent one we had. And he's got his issues as well. But let me get off of that. You know, as I've stated before, Christians always want to walk around on a moral high horse like their deeds were benevolent. There's a group called the Equal Justice Initiative, and it said that these were just not celebratory acts of racial control and domination. They were rituals. And specifically, they were rituals of Southern evangelicalism and its then dogma of purity, literalism, and white supremacy. And a guy named Brian Stevenson is actually the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. And Stevenson said, you know, a few years ago, I began to realize that the people who enforce the law are shaped by narratives. They are shaped by an understanding of history and their values and their responsiveness. And with regard to race, I think we've done a very poor job in America of confronting our history. The reason we have an issue, in my opinion, the reason we have an issue confronting our history is because history has been written and shaped by the people who were doing all the wrong and made themselves look great in the process. You know, historian Amy Louise Wood wrote in Lynch and Spectacle, Witnessing Racial Violence in America, 1890 to 1940. It would be inconceivable that they could inflict pain and torment on the bodies of black men without imagining that violence is as a religious act laden with Christian symbolism and significance. Now, remember the video I did some time back asking, is Christianity pagan? I don't even think pagans were as brutal as Christians. You see, the God of the white South demanded purity, you know, embodied by the white woman. You know, I've mentioned many times in videos and even in my book that white women were placed as the standard of purity in this country. And if you wanted a reason to kill a black man, all you had to do was accuse him of doing something to a white woman. You know, I watched a true crime show the other day that took place in Saskatoon, Canada. And my wife and I were sitting there watching, and, you know, an 18-year-old girl was killed after going out to a party with her best friend. You know, police interviewed the friend. She said they went to a motel with two black men who they did drugs with. She said she went to the restroom, and when she returned, her friend was dead, and one of the black guys said she had to help him hide the body or she will be killed as well. You know, and in the end, it was her that killed her best friend. And the two black guys never existed. You know, the week before Thanksgiving, my wife and I were watching a program, and a Hispanic guy had a vending booth set up on the street, as did several others. But he was the only Hispanic out there. A white woman went to his booth, started cursing him out. She then proceeded to spit in his face. Then she pushed him. After each incident she did to him, she would place her phone, turn her phone on him in case he retaliated. And that way the system would take her side for being the aggressor, for him being the aggressor. This gentleman never did anything to her. He never spat back on her. He never pushed her back. He even walked away, and she followed him, continuing to torment him. It just so happened somebody else was recording the entire episode. No police ever showed up, even though someone called. Now, I tell you what, had he spit on her or pushed her back, I guarantee the police would have showed up because she was a white woman. Don't get mad at me for telling you how the system works. When I did that, was invited to do a political speech back in 2011, 2012, one of those years. And one of the things I said in that speech about Social Security actually goes into a fund to take care of the person in this country who has the longest lifespan, and that's the white woman. So black men and women are going to work, and everybody else that's paying into the Social Security system are actually literally paying into the system to take care of white women. And a white woman listened to that video, and she emailed me and called me and something. She said, Myron, you absolutely right. It goes into a fund to take care of us. She said, there are some parameters that take place. She said, but yeah, it's there to take care of white women. But I guarantee if this guy would have did something to her and they told her a white woman had got hit or spit on, the police would have showed up immediately. This guy walked away. He showed great patience and resilience. But he was better than me, because if you spit on me, I think that's the lowest form of disrespect. You know, I told you on a previous video that turning up the cheek doesn't mean what we've been taught. In saying that, in saying that, I would have knocked her ass out. But that's just me. But history and society has painted an image so much that all black men are evil, and it becomes really easy to believe a black guy did something wrong, especially if a white woman said he did. This woman killed her best friend and blamed 2 black guys. You know, I mentioned before how a guy named Mac Brown, black guy, was arrested for being an eye rapist because they felt that he looked at a white woman with the intent to rape her. Can you believe that? He looked at a white woman. He looked at a white woman. He looked at a white woman. And they said because he looked at her, he had the intention to rape her. Dick Rowland. Y'all, many of you should be familiar with Dick Rowland. He was the elevator operator in Tulsa. And he was actually accused of touching a white woman. And, you know, the white woman even said, you know, he didn't touch her. You know, somebody else actually made up the story. If you go back and study the Tulsa riot, you know, somebody else said he touched her. She never said he touched her. And there are a few more accounts in my book, but hey, what do I know? See, white women have been the biggest reasons black men were hung, lynched, beaten, and murdered. Now, don't get mad at me. Check the historical records for yourself. Black men have been accused of rape by some white women to cover up affairs that they were having with that black man. And once they were caught by their husbands, they would lie. During slavery, it wasn't just the slaveholders doing the raping of the men and women slaves. The white wives of these slaveholders were raping the black slave men and boys as well. This behavior was even prevalent in the Bible when, y'all remember Joseph from the Bible, when he wouldn't cater to Pharaoh's wife demands, and then she accused him of rape. So you see, accusing a black man who refuses advances of a woman has a long history. And yes, Joseph was black. He was one of Jacob's sons. Jacob was black. Okay? So, if you want some more information on it, there are several documentaries on this YouTube platform to tell you about the many accounts of white slave master women and how they treated the black male slaves. See, many of those who defended lynching believed their acts were a Christian duty consecrated as God's will against racial transgression. These so-called God-loving people had a messed up sense of entitlement and belief system. One guy who thought lynching was a Christian duty said it was nothing but the vengeance of an outraged God. Now, with this type of behavior, who do you think God was upset with? It was a Christian duty, huh? What does the Bible say? Well, I'm glad you asked. In Matthew 25:40, it states, "And the sovereign shall answer and say to them, Truly, I say to you, insofar as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." Now, contrary to what many preachers have been teaching us for centuries, the Messiah was not hung from a cross. He was hung from a tree. So they've been hanging black men from trees for a long time. And yeah, I said black men because the Messiah was black too. I don't care what these preachers say about, you know, we don't know what color the Messiah was, even though the Bible's got plenty of accounts in there of what color he was, even though the Bible says Jacob's seed was black and the Messiah came down through the seed of David, which was a son of David, a son of Jacob. We know Shem's entire line was black. Shem, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We know all that was black. So if all the fathers were black, what does that make Messiah? I saw one guy said, Stop it with these mixed race children. You assume the identity of your father. And if you read any account of the Bible, this is true. The Father gives you your identity. That's why the Bible says we were created in His image. But you got a lot of people out there talking about the patriarchal society took over from the matriarchal society. No, it didn't. The Bible said we were made in His image. So we take the identity of our Father. So the Messiah was black. So they've been hanging black men from trees for a long time. In Acts 5:30 it states, the Elohim of our fathers raised up Yahusha. And remember, Elohim is plural. It's a duality, not a trinity. The Elohim of our fathers raised up Yahusha, whom ye slew and hung from a tree. So if the Bible says he was hung from a tree, who changed it to a cross? The cross is a death symbol. I told y'all that in a previous video. The cross is literally a Roman symbol for death. Acts 10:39 says, and we are witnesses of all things which he did both in the land of the Yahudim and Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Acts 13:29 says, when they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. Galatians 3:13 said, Mashiach redeemed us from the curse of the Torah by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. You see, verses like those actually solidified the white Christian thought process of the curse of Ham to say the entire black race was cursed. Like every black person on earth only descended from Ham. So many white Christians felt that they were advocates for God in killing these black menaces to society. Do you know what that tells me? These same white Christians would have been in the crowd when the Messiah was hung. How can I say these so-called believers would have probably been in there when the Messiah was hung? In John 18, verses 39 to 40, it reads, but we have a custom that I should release unto you at the Pekish. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the king of the Yahudim, or Yahudim? Then cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Bar Abba. Now, Bar Abba was a robber. That shows you that people don't care about their action. They would rather kill a man of faith than admit they are a true criminal. And you heard me say Pekish, which means Passover. Bar Abba means Barabbas. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Professor Emeritus Donald G. Matthews wrote in Journal of Southern Religion, religions permeated communal lynching because the act occurred within the context of a sacred order designed to sustain holiness. The sacred order was white supremacy, and the holiness was white virtue. NAACP leader Walter White said in 1929 that it is exceedingly doubtful if lynching could possibly exist under any other religion than Christianity. And you know, that's amazing to me because lots of Christians complain about the barbaric practices of Islam. See, Christians love to do a masterful job of hiding their atrocities, but they sure know how to point out all other religions' faults and downfalls. There was only one group of Christians during this time in history who were opposed to lynching. Can you guess which group it was? It was black Christians. You know, addressing racism was not considered a biblical issue, but a social and political one. But on studying this topic of lynching, we can see that lynching was an act of religious significance justified by the Christianity of the day. You know, it was also political. It was an act of terror. It was an act of social control of black people. You know, in 1902, a black man named Alonzo Tucker was lynched from a bridge in the coastal town of Coos Bay, Oregon. He had been accused of assaulting a white woman, and an angry mob had formed to take his life in the streets. See, we have a tendency, and rightfully so, to praise those men who fought and defended against slavery. But slavery in the South was upheld by Christian slaveholders. And you need to find out who the Christian slaveholders were. It was upheld by plantation owners. You need to find out who owned most of those plantations. It was upheld by churches. It was upheld by Christian denominations. It was upheld by Christian theologians. See, there were a lot of Christians who fought against lynchings and slavery, but the great majority of Christians were happy with business as usual. You know, although some denominations have apologized for the past treatment of blacks, it hasn't been enough. An apology is a start, but if we truly want healing to happen, we need more white Christians actively working to shrink the divide within the ranks of the white Christian churches. I've mentioned that some whites were also lynched, especially if they were standing against their white peers and standing up for the rights of blacks. You see, the ratio of black lynching victims to white lynching victims was 4-to-1 from the years 1882 to 1889. And it increased to more than the ratio of 6-to-1 between 1890 and 1900. And then it jumped from more than 17-to-1 after 1900. And see, many of your writers of history like to say, you know, that lynching, you know, that was just a tool used for crime control. No, however, what history proves is that lynching was used more as a tool for racial control and white dominance. In 1906, a black guy named Edward Johnson was convicted of raping a white woman and sentenced to death by an all-white jury in Chattanooga, Tennessee. His attorneys appealed the case and won a rare stay of execution from the United States Supreme Court. Guess what happened? In response, a white mob seized Mr. Johnson from the jail, which had been all of a sudden vacated by the sheriff and his entire staff. This mob dragged him through the streets, hanging him from the second span of the Walnut Street Bridge, and shot him hundreds of times. The mob left a note pinned on the corpse that read, "To Justin Harlan, come get your nigga now." Mr. Johnson used his last words to declare his innocence. Nearly a century later, he was cleared of the rape. You see, white men many times don't care if a black man is innocent or not, as long as they get the chance to administer some form of justice, their own justice, even if they're wrong. You know, like around here, you know, Ronald Reagan and all these other, and I got the video on the channel about gun control, who they put in place for. You know, they putting all these mechanisms in place to keep guns out of the black hand while white people study stocking weapons. But they want to assert their dominance, power, and control. See, once whites, and figure out which whites I'm talking about, once they lost the slavery aspect, they had to find another way to maintain power and control. So they used blood, terror, lynchings, beatings, fear of being killed to accomplish those ends. And it worked. Blacks lived in constant fear for their lives, never knowing where the next white threat or attack was coming from. You know, as I stated, why do you think all the gun control laws were put in place? The system wanted to make sure they can continue to treat black people as inferiors, and knowing blacks did not have weapons to defend and protect themselves, and terrorizing them became very easy, especially when the justice system was not protecting them of their rights. That's why they got mad at blacks buying those Saturday night specials, you know, some years ago. You know, I have a video on this channel, all the gun control laws put in place to make sure we as black people never obtain any guns to defend ourselves. A few months ago, early this year, I don't know which month it was, but a senator out of New Jersey said, if you aren't rich, you don't need a gun. And he specifically noted communities that were predominantly black. This is today. This is a white senator out of New Jersey today. Many of those white men of the era of lynching were nothing more than vigilantes, being judge, jury, and executioner. And in my opinion, cowards. Why wasn't the church battling this? Why wasn't the church battling this? Well, because many of them were participants. 25% of black men lynched were accused of rape. 30% of black men lynched were accused of murder. And how many accounts of rape were black men accused of and later found out that that the stories were fabricated? However, by that time they had already been killed by the lynch mobs. See, blacks were lynched for non-criminal violations of social customs, uh, racial expectations, such as speaking to white people with less respect or formality than observers believe was due. You get that? Black people were lynched that they sometimes ask to be treated with respect. But whites will lynch a black person for speaking to them with less respect. And whites, both men and women, call black men boy without any issue. Blacks had to show them the highest respect based on the standards they put in place. And depending on who was with them at the time they encountered a black person, if they wanted to show dominance, they showed out for their white counterparts. But blacks will continually call boy, monkey, and nigger. How many of you heard the story about Booker T. Washington walking down the street one day, and a white southern woman was up on her porch and saw him walking and said, "Hey boy, come up here and chop this wood for me." And Booker T. Washington took off his coat and went chop the wood, finished, put his coat back on and went on about his way. And her housekeeper, black lady, told her, "Ma'am, do you realize who that was? That was Booker T. Washington." And so she had somebody send for Booker T. Washington the next day and asked him to come back. She apologized for treating him that way. She just saw a black man. But it was only when her housekeeper told her that was a black man of significance that she apologized. But all she saw as a white woman was a black man. She saw a laborer. She saw a slave. In 1901, Bailey Crutchfield's brother allegedly found a lost wallet containing $120 and kept the money. He was arrested and about to be lynched by a mob in Smith County, Tennessee, when at the last moment he broke free and escaped. Thwarted in their attempt to kill the suspect, the mob turned their attention to his sister and lynched Miss Crutchfield and her brother instead, though she was not accused of any involvement in the theft. They killed his sister. They killed his sister. They killed his sister. She had nothing to do with it. They killed his sister. And so you have to understand, when they use the term allegedly, what they mean is he stole it. You know, I actually just saw a video on YouTube where a young black woman actually found a wallet, tried to return it to the rightful owner, and was actually accused of stealing it. So we say things have gotten better, but this just happened in December of last year. So we're still battling some of the same mindset that America has said no longer exists or prevails. Right today. The thousands of blacks lynched between 1880 and 1950 differed in many respects, but in most cases the circumstances of their murders can be categorized as one or more of the following. Lynchings that resulted from a wildly distorted fear of interracial sex, lynchings in response to casual social transgressions, lynchings based on allegations of serious violent crime, public spectacle lynchings, lynchings that escalated into large-scale violence targeted the entire black community, and lynchings of sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted mistreatment, which were most common between 1915 and 1940. See, the mere accusation of rape, even without identification by the alleged victim, often aroused the mob and resulted in lynching. Now get this. White men would do this to black men for mistreating white women, allegedly. But these same white men were mistreating their own women. And these same white men were around there molesting their own daughters. Some of these white men were molesting their own sons. But they had the nerve to call black men beast. Yeah, it's all in the history. Go check it yourself. Don't take my word for nothing. See, the definition of black on white rape in the South was abroad, and it actually required no allegation of force because white institutional laws and most white people rejected the idea that a white woman could or willingly consent to sex with a black man. Because they felt like black people were beneath them. They got mad if a white woman was interested in a black man because they felt like she was a traitor to the race. Ida B. Wells actually published an an editorial challenging the myth of widespread black-on-white sexual violence and insisted that consensual interracial sex did not occur. White mob burned her newspaper offices and threatened to lynch her. And right today, if you check, crime stats show that white men hardly rape black or Hispanic women, if at all. But they show that black men rape white women on a regular basis. Now ask yourself, what group of men are really doing most of the rapes in this country? Come on, think about it. I'm not saying black men are, free, and, of course, I'm not saying all. I'm not saying black men are free from raping white women, but I'm just saying the stats ain't telling you the truth. See, you got to dig deep to find out who's really doing most of the raping. And it's white men. In 1889 in Aberdeen, Mississippi, Keith Bowen allegedly tried to enter a room where 3 white women were sitting. Though no further allegations were made against him, Mr. Bowen was lynched by the entire white neighborhood for his offense. William Brooks was lynched in 1894 in Palestine, Arkansas, after he asked his white employer for permission to marry the man's daughter. General Lee, a black man, was lynched by a white mob in 1904 for merely knocking on the door of a white woman's house in Reevesville, South Carolina. In 1912, Thomas Miles was lynched for allegedly writing letters to a white woman, inviting her to have a cold drink with him. 1934, after being accused of associating with a white woman in Newton, Texas, John Griggs was hanged and shot 17 times, and his body was dragged behind a car through the town for hours. And if you're thinking that was long ago, I want to remind you of James Byrd, who was dragged behind a truck, Ford truck in 1998, right here in the town of Jasper, Texas. As we hear these accounts, not one time did we ever learn of any slave owner face judgment, on this side anyway, on the earth's side, for raping black women. When this event happened to James Byrd, 2 of the defendants were sentenced to death. And this was actually the first time in the state of Texas that any white man had ever been sentenced to death for killing a black person. Lawrence Brewer, who was one of the offenders, he was actually executed in 2011. That was just 12 years ago. The day before his execution, this is what he said. Remember, 2011. 12 years ago. Now, I think it was September 2011, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember. I think it was September 2011. So roughly almost 12 years ago. 12 years, 2 months ago. But this is what Brewer said. As far as any regrets, no. I have no regrets. No. I'd do it all over again, to tell you the truth. Remember, this was 12 years ago. And we still dealing with this behavior. There are some towns right today in Texas that black folks will not stop in during the day or night. In this great country, we still have towns where blacks are afraid to stop. Around the same time that Brewer was executed, 2011, yeah, it was 2011, I was driving back from Memphis, and I had to go through one of those towns, and it was around midnight. My check engine light came on. This was puzzling to me because I had just got the car serviced a day or two before I took the trip to Memphis. But under no circumstances was I going to stop in that town. I called one of my sisters and I talked to her until I got to the next town to check the car out. And once I stopped at the little convenience store or whatever, check everything. I say, well, I'm going to have to drive. There's nobody out here this time of night. I don't know anybody here. I'm going to take my chances on driving home. And so I called my sister back and I talked to her all the way home. And, she was the only one still up. She lived, at the time, she lived on the West Coast. She was 2 hours behind. So, I talked to her until I got home. But I refused to stop in that other town when that check engine light came on, to tell you that. In 1940, Jesse Thornton was lynched in Laverne, Alabama for referring to a white police officer by his name without the title of Mr. Lloyd Gaines vanished in March 1939. 3 months before he vanished, he had actually won a Supreme Court decision, Gaines versus Canada, mandating the state of Missouri admit him into its university law school or build a separate and equal law school for blacks. In 1918, Private Charles Lewis was lynched in Hickman, Kentucky, after he refused to empty his pockets while wearing his army uniform. Richard Wilkinson was lynched in Manchester, Tennessee in 1934 for allegedly slapping a white man who had assaulted a black woman at an African-American dance. White men lynched Jeff Brown in 1916 in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi for accidentally bumping into a white girl as he ran to catch a train. In 1917, Sam Gates was lynched for the offense of annoying white girls in England, Arkansas. Now, think back to what I said about Wilkinson, Richard Wilkinson. He was lynched because he defended a black woman who had been assaulted by a white man. Frank Embry was stripped naked before they lynched him. Who was taking these pictures? Christians. That's who. If I remember, I'm going to put a picture of Frank Embry on the screen. Henry Smith was lynched in Paris, Texas in 1893. A large crowd followed the lynching, as was common then in the style of public executions. Henry Smith was fastened to a wooden platform, tortured for 50 minutes by red-hot iron brands, and burned alive as more than 10,000 Christian spectators cheered. 10,000 Christians watched this man burn alive. 10,000 Christians. A South Carolina Christian governor and senator, speaking on the floor of the U.S. Senate in 1900, said, "We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed him to be the equal of the white man, and we will not submit to his gratifying lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him." But it was standard practice for white men to gratify their lust on black women. And as I stated, these same white men were satisfying their lust on their own wives and their own daughters. At the lynching of Reuben Stacy in Fort Lauderdale, June 19, 1935, there's an image with a young white girl with a smile on her face. For over 1,000 years, during a period known as Christian dominance, public execution provided entertainment for all the family. You hear that? It was Christian entertainment. Christians gathered to watch black people murdered and called it entertainment. Apart from publicly torturing the mentally ill, it was pretty much the only permissible activity that provided innocent family fun, as well as delivering a moral lesson. You hear that? It was considered fun for the whole family and taught morality at the same time. That's a hell of a way to teach your family about morals. And we wonder why the attitude toward blacks have persisted for so long. You don't undo something like that overnight. As a matter of fact, you don't undo something like that over the course of a few years either. And based on what happened to James Byrd just 25 years ago, you don't undo it after 100 years. How bad were these white Christians? They took pictures of the lynchings, put them on postcards, and sold them. Even the Nazis didn't stoop that low. By the year 1908, the trade had grown so large and the practice of sending postcards featuring the victims of mob murders had become so repugnant that the U.S. Postmaster General banned the cards from mail. That's pretty bad when the Postmaster General said it was too much. And we know back then the Postmaster General wasn't black. That's bad when even a white guy said it was too much. Lynching photographs were printed for postcards, newspapers, and event mementos. Typically, these images depicted the black lynching victim and all part of the white Christian crowd in attendance. Spectators included women and children. Now, it's amazing that They never took the chance. They never could identify any of those perpetrators of those who were doing the lynching. The lynchings were actually advertised in the newspapers prior to the event in order to give photographers time to arrive early and prepare their camera equipment. After the lynching, the photographers would sell their pictures as postcards, sometimes costing as much as 50 cents a piece. Get this one, Christians. Church services were sometimes shortened to allow the congregation to get to the lynching in time. These people left the house of worship early so they could attend lynching. But even better than that, the pastor shut the church services down early so all the good white Christians could have their Sunday fun day. And I told you before, Sunday ain't the Sabbath anyway. Y'all see why it was hard for me to produce this one? Y'all see why it took me so long to put this information out? This is painful. In 2000, a book was released called Without Sanctuary. And it's actually a book of lynching postcards collected by James Allen. And Pulitzer Prize winning historian Leon Litwack wrote about the good church-going folk responsible for the culture of lynching. The photograph stretched out credulity, even numb our minds and sense to the full extent of the horror. But they must be examined if we are to understand how normal men and women could live with, participate in, and defend such atrocities, even reinterpret them so they would not see themselves or be perceived as less than civilized. The men and women who tortured, dismembered, and murdered in this fashion understood perfectly well what they were doing and thought of themselves as perfectly normal human beings. Few had any ethical qualms about their actions. This was not the outburst of crazed men or uncontrolled barbarians, but the triumph of a belief system that defined one people as less human than the other. For the men and women who composed these mobs, as for those who remained silent and indifferent or who provided scholarly or scientific explanation, this was the highest idealism in the service of their race. One has only to view the self-satisfied expressions on their face as they posed beneath black people hanging from a rope or next to the charred remains of a Negro who had been burned to death. What is most disturbing about these scenes is the discovery that the perpetrators of the crimes were ordinary people, not so different from ourselves: merchants, farmers, laborers, machine operators, teachers, doctors, lawyers, policemen, students. They were family men and women, good church-going folks who came to believe that keeping black people in their place was nothing less than pest control, a way of combating an epidemic or virus that, if not checked, would be detrimental to the health and security of the community. Yet whites want to continue to call us barbaric as people. And like hell, I disagree with Litwack on something. Like hell, they normal people. And I think he wasn't saying they're normal people. Ain't no way in hell you normal and you doing stuff like that. You twisted in the head, you wicked, you evil. You ain't normal. Something wrong with you. Kingdom Identity Ministries in Harrison, Arkansas, that said that only inferior white women date outside of their race. Be proud of your heritage and stop being a race-mixing slut. As a matter of fact, Harrison, Arkansas is known as the national headquarters of the KKK, just so you know. A few years ago, a white guy went there to find the most racist town in the U.S. and was called all types of names by white people. He was holding a Black Lives Matter sign. You know, it's still so racist that only 0.3% of the population is black. Is black right today. Not 3%, 0.3%. Just like Christian denominations tried to erase their participation in the slave trade, just last summer, they tried to have their racist past and KKK connections screwed from their Wikipedia page. You know, here are a couple of things these good Christian white folks said to the guy as they drove by. Have a little pride in your race, brother. White pride worldwide. Find Jesus, another man urges. So what the one who said find Jesus meant was that if he found Jesus, he wouldn't accept black people. At least that's my understanding. They actually have a website in this city called whiteprideradio.com. One guy drove by 3 times, and on the 3rd time, he told Rob, about 10 minutes, I'm going to be back. You better not be effing, you better be effing gone. And Rob is the guy who was holding the sign. Amazingly, all of the people who were captured on video threatening him are now trying to sue him because he didn't blur their faces. I guess like the old KKK days of old, they want to hide their racist identities. This is America today. This is America today. You know, as I've stated before, although things have improved, we still have a long way to go. And based on the way things are going, I don't know if we'll ever get there. Not on this side anyway. Many blacks accused of no serious crime were lynched for offenses that were not categorically offense, including speaking disrespectfully, refusing to step off the sidewalk, using profane language, using an improper title for a white person, suing a white man, arguing with a white man, bumping into a white woman, insulting a white person, and other social grievances. So, everything blacks were being punished, imprisoned, and killed for, whites were dealing with no repercussions to black people. I guess that's what they really mean by land of the free. Free for the white people. And hey, and I've stated before, don't come at me, because I'm not a racist. I love everybody. But I get tired of everybody trying to gloss over what things have been historically done to black people and still been done to black people. We got to come up off of this nonsense. Like I saw a meme the other day with a white guy on it when a cop pulled him over and gave him a ticket. And he told the cop, you know, but I was told there would be privileges. So, I've told you on other videos, you know, how many black CEOs we have of Fortune 500 companies. Who's at the bottom of the economic barrel? And, you know, you just look at all this stuff. So, who's been denied home loan historically and still right today more than anybody? When we get home or business loans, who's getting the higher interest rates? So, yeah, I said that's what land of the free really means. You know, after centuries of slavery and maltreatment of blacks, whites had the nerve to do these things of black people who in many cases had not committed a crime at all. Whites made basic living by black people a crime. Blacks had to address whites by titles, or it was made into a crime by whites. But whites would call them black boys monkey, blacks boy, monkey, beast, nigger, coon. What did rapper Birdman say? Put some respect on my name. White men had to force respect, but they didn't give respect to black men, women, or children. They called our ancestors animals. Anytime you have to force respect, you are not worthy of respect. But they didn't give respect to black men, women, or children. Your character is flawed, and ain't no title in front of your name gonna fix that. People that have to be addressed by titles have some of the poorest self-images. Am I saying they're not worthy of their accomplishment? No, I'm not saying that at all. But many of them have to tell people they are Dr. So-and-so or Reverend so-and-so. Miles Monroe said there's nothing worse than a well-educated self-hater. He asked, what title did you see in front of any of the prophets of the Bible? We don't see Paul, Moses being addressed as pastor or reverend, and both of them were highly educated. We never seen the Messiah say, doctor, you know, reverend, you know, none of that nonsense. You know, we did say master. You know, what's John's title? You know, Peter had a nickname. He was the Rock. But he wasn't Reverend Peter. He wasn't Dr. Peter. As I mentioned the account earlier about a black man could be killed if they harmed an animal. Whites placed more value on the life of an animal than they did on the life of a human because they were black. Considering whites called black people animals, why didn't they value the perceived life of that animal? Whites felt that their lives were much more valuable than the life of a black person. And if you really want an education, do some study and find out which groups of whites created racism and which group of whites promoted heavily the curse of Ham. When you start researching these things, a lot of things change for you mentally. White Christians don't even realize how this particular group of whites have manipulated them to the white supremacy mindset, and once their usefulness is done, they themselves will be turned out to pasture. After a white woman was raped in Lewiston, North Carolina in 1918, a black man named Peter Bazemore was accused of the crime and lynched by a mob before an investigation revealed that the real perpetrator had been a white man wearing black makeup. Bazemore was lynched for something a white man done. Barry Norris was accused of killing a local sheriff in Lexington, Tennessee in 1918, and an angry mob lynched him in a courtroom square. Dragged his body through the streets of town, shot the body dozens of times, and burned the body in the middle of the street. And below hung banners that read, "This is the way we do our bit." They were proud of the way they did things. Thomasville, Georgia, 1930. A black man named William Kirkland was arrested for the alleged rape of a 9-year-old white girl. And before a trial could be held, a mob of between 50 and 75 white men seized him from the jail, hung his body from a tree, riddled it with bullets, and then dragged the corpse through town behind a truck before depositing it on a courthouse lawn. Just 3 days after Mr. Kirkland's lynching, a black man named Lacey Mitchell was lynched in Thomasville for testifying against a white man accused of raping a black woman. That sounds like two different justice systems in the same place, don't it? Mr. Mitchell, a key witness, was shot in his home by 4 white men and died. The white defendant was acquitted and released. The black man was killed for testifying against a white animal, and the white animal was acquitted. Public spectacle lynchings were those in which large crowds of white people, often numbered in the thousands, gathered to witness pre-planned, heinous killings that featured prolonged torture, mutilation, dismemberment, and or burning the victim. In 1904, after Luther Hobart allegedly killed a local white landowner, and him and a black woman believed to be his wife were captured by a mob and taken to Dodgeville, Mississippi to be lynched before hundreds of white spectators. Both victims were tied to a tree and forced to hold out their hands while members of the mob methodically chopped off their fingers and distributed them as souvenirs. Next, their ears were cut off. Mr. Hobart was being beaten so severely that his skull was fractured and one of his eyes was left hanging from its socket. Members of the mob used a large corkscrew to bore holes into the victim's body and pull out large chunks of quivering flesh, after which both victims were thrown onto a raging fire and burned. The white men, women, and children present watched the horrific murders while enjoying deviled eggs, lemonade, and whiskey in a picnic-like atmosphere. I mean, white folks dared to have the nerve to call black savages. These white folks sat and ate while this stuff was going on, like you sit and watch a TV show while having dinner. Another public spectacle lynching took place in 1917 in Memphis, Tennessee, when a mob of 25 men seized L. Persons from a train that was transporting him to stand trial for rape and murder. The mob had announced the lynching time and location in advance, and thousands of people attended, bagging up traffic for miles. You hear that? They set up lynching times like it was a sporting event. Food and gum vendors sold their wares to the many spectators as Mr. Persons was doused with gasoline, set on fire. A 10-year-old black child was forced to sit next to the fire and watch him die. When members of the crowd complained that Mr. Persons would die too quickly if burned, the fire was extinguished, and attendees fought over Mr. Persons' clothes and remnants of the rope to keep as mementos. You hear that? They They wanted him to suffer greatly, so they put the fire out. 2 men cut off his ears for souvenirs. After which the head of Mr. Person's corpse was removed and thrown into a crowd in the Memphis Black Commercial District. These folks announced a time and place for the party, and many whites showed up. This Christianity is something else. Later that year, just a few hours away in Dyersburg, Tennessee, Lynch Scott was subjected to a brutal and prolonged lynching after being accused of criminal assault. Thousands gathered at a vacant lot across the street from the downtown courthouse, and children sat atop their parents' shoulders to get a better view as Mr. Scott's clothes and skin were ripped off with knives. A mob tortured Lynch Scott with a hot poker iron, gouging out his eyes, shoving a hot poker down his throat, and pressing it all over his body before castrating him and burning him alive over a slow fire. Mr. Scott's torturous killing lasted more than 3 hours. The crowds of hundreds or thousands of white people attending as participants or spectators included elected officials and prominent citizens. White press coverage regularly defended the lynchings as justified, and cursory investigations rarely led to identifications of lynch mob members, much less prosecutions. White men, women, and children fought over bloodied ropes, clothing, and body parts, and proudly displayed these souvenirs with no fear of punishment. In Newman, Georgia, in 1899, pieces of Sam Hose's heart, liver, and bone were sold after he was lynched. They still doing organ harvesting today. That's why a lot of your black young people are disappearing. And they're organ harvesting, because blacks have been scientifically proven to have the strongest organs out of everybody. But they sold his piece of his heart, liver, and bone after he was lynched. That same year, spectators at the lynching of Richard Coleman in Maysville, Kentucky, took flesh, teeth, fingers, and toes from his corpse. Spectacle lynchings were preserved in photographs that were made into postcards and distributed unashamedly throughout the mail. August 7, 1930, in Marion, Indiana, a mob lynched 2 colored boys, Thomas Shipp, 18 years old, Abram Smith, 19, who were to be tried for the murder the night before of Claude Dieter, 23, and alleged rape of his companion Mary Ball, 19. After getting the word of his stick-up murder and assault, an angry mob stormed the old Grant County Jail, took the boys out one at a time, brutally beating and lynching them both. The mob was in the process of lynching a 3rd boy, the 2's younger accomplice, James Cameron, who had left them right before the incident, yet somehow he would be released alive. That's actually from a lynching in the Heartland. The 2 lynched bodies were photographed above those left from the mob and hung by the Grant County Courthouse as an example to other blacks. No one from the mob was ever convicted for their crime. For many years after, this tragedy would haunt the city of Marion, staining it as the town of the last confirmed racial lynching in the northern United States. Now, don't miss that last statement. It was the last confirmed lynching, which usually means there was some more. Now, you cannot help but ask yourself the question, where were the white Christians when they were hanging those 2 black boys, said Reverend Mike Henson, pastor of Bethel Worship Center, to the members of the Grant County Ethnic Diversity Task Force on Tuesday, October 7, 2003. I asked myself that question, where were they? The white Christians were likely in the crowd, possibly at home, either unaware or unattached from the scene of the crime. But evidence indicates that many churchgoers had taken part in the Marion lynching. Reverend Dr. William N. Lyons, conference minister of the Southwest Conference of the United Church of Christ, said this: white culture believes and perpetuates stereotypes and untruth about black culture in order to sustain our white privilege. That is why just this week a Central Park dog walker, Amy Cooper, who is white, called the police and reported her life was being threatened when a bird watcher, Christian Cooper, who is black, asked her to comply with posted rules and put her dog on a leash. My integrity compels me to admit that I am a racist. I was taught racial biases. Not always tacitly, I have willingly learned and practiced these patterns of behavior because that is what white people expect of other white people. Because that is what white people expect of other white people. And because our systems reward racism. Our systems reward racism. My whiteness has become unmanageable in that I am addicted to my privilege. I am addicted to my privilege. I do not want to be a racist, yet I commit racism every time I interact with or feel or believe differently about someone who is not white, or when I act to preserve my privilege. Preserve my privilege. While I am working to be more aware and to overcome my privilege and my racism, that does not mean I am not racist. That means when I succeed, I am a racist in recovery. Until white people confess and change what is happening inside of ourselves, black people will continue to bear our sins in their bodies. That's the end of that. Back to the woman with the dog. Here's another case of a white woman who thinks she's above the law. She called the police on a black man because she was breaking the law. And did you hear what he said? He just asked her to follow the law. Get this. 2013. It was only 10 years ago. A guy named Jonathan Kelso created a series called A Song Without Words. And here's something Kelso said. When I began, I thought it was just the KKK and the Fringe who were responsible. He says, but I quickly realized through research that these crimes, hold on a second. These crimes were carried, let me slow down. These crimes were carried out by the entire community on Sunday after church. See, the KKK is the easy answer to take the focus off what white Christians were doing. But get this. The only way a person could join the KKK was if and only if they were Christian. They felt it was their God-given right to administer justice for God to maintain white superiority. And right today, if you want to join an organization, you still have to be a Christian. Yes, they are still around. Why is that? Why would a terror organization require you to be a Christian before you can become a member? It's because in their heart of hearts, they truly believe they are God's ministers of justice for racial inferiors. You know, after hearing all these accounts, you know, I previously mentioned, do you realize that Southern apologists had the nerve to say that only black men who raped white women were lynched, and because of their behavior, lynching was justified? I.T. Burgess, a preacher in Putnam County, Florida, was hanged in 1894 after being accused of planning to instigate a revolt, according to a May 30th, 1894 story in the Atlanta Constitution newspaper. Later that year, in December, the Constitution also reported Lucius Turner, a preacher near West Point, Georgia, was shot by two brothers for apparently writing an insulting note to their sister. Ida B. Wells wrote in her 1895 editorial a red record about Reverend King, a minister in Paris, Texas, who was beaten with a Winchester rifle and placed on a train out of town. His offense, he said, was being the only person in Lamar County to speak against the horrific 1893 lynching of the handyman Henry Smith. I mentioned Henry Smith earlier. June 21st, 1903, a white pastor of Olivet Presbyterian Church in Delaware used his religious leadership to incite a lynching. Preaching to a crowd of 3,000 gathered in downtown Wilmington, Reverend Robert A. Elwood urged the jury in the trial of George White, a black farm laborer accused of raping and killing a 17-year-old white girl, Helen Bishop, to pronounce White guilty speedily. Otherwise, Elwood continued, according to a June 23, 1903 New York Times article, White should be lynched. He cited the biblical text, 1 Corinthians 5 and 13, which orders Christians to expel the wicked person from among you. I keep telling you, Christianity and the Bible don't correlate. They don't go together. True Bible believers will never stoop to a level so low. But apparently Christians do. The responsibility for lynching would be yours for the laying and execution of the law, Reverend Elwood thundered, exhorting the jury. George White was dragged out of jail the next day, bound, and burned alive in front of 2,000 people. So I guess the other 1,000 couldn't show up that day. Because, you know, he said it to his congregation of 3,000. Following Sunday, a black pastor named Montrose W. Thornton discussed the week's barbarities with his own congregation in Wilmington. He urged self-defense. There's but one part left for the persecuted Negro when charged with crime and when innocent. Be a law unto yourself, he told his parishioners. Die in your tracks, perhaps drinking the blood of your pursuer. Newspapers around the country denounced both sermons. An editorial in the Washington Star said both pastors had contributed to the worst passions of the mob. Isn't it amazing that because a black preacher was teaching blacks to defend themselves, that was frowned upon? By inciting lynching and advocating for self-defense, the editor's judge, Elwood and Thornton had brought the pulpit into disrepute. Isn't it amazing when blacks get tired of being cut down by white society, they're always considered the aggressor? You know, I think I told you in that video the other cheek, every time something happens to a black person by a white person, they always got the microphone and camera in the black person's face because they expecting the black person to say, well, I forgive them. I forgive them. But they don't do that to nobody else. They always want us to forgive what's been done to us. But they don't never forgive if we do something. Right today, we still are reminded that the Jews don't forget what happened to them. They ain't forgave nobody. But they always want us to forgive what was done to us. February 28, 2022, the House passed an anti-lynching bill. They named it after Emmett Till. And y'all know the story of Emmett Till, killed in 1955. And look how long it took the government to do anything about the lynching. But guess what else was in the bill? Wording for the LGBT community. Why does anything and everything put on the table for blacks always have to have attachments to it for some other group? And why do they always attach issues to that community to anything for us? And you have black folks out here telling other black folks to go and vote to help make things right for us. How long has the Congressional Black Caucus been around? And what year did the anti-lynching bill get passed? Okay then. So black politicians do nothing to address our grievances. The Congressional Black Caucus does nothing to address our grievances. The Democratic president did nothing to address our grievances. For some reason, we're still so bamboozled into thinking Democrats, black and white, care about us. Joe Biden hasn't done anything to help blacks. Barack Obama said he was everybody's president and could do nothing for blacks, although he did things for several other groups. This anti-lynching bill passed 120 years after Republican George Henry White introduced the very first one in 1902. A 1935 questionnaire answered by 5,000 ministers showed that only 3.3% had preached or worked against lynching in some way. Did you hear me say 5,000? So that means only 165 preachers had done something to address lynching. 165 out of 5,000. Most simply felt that lynching was inevitable and that in taking a stance, they would divide and alienate their congregations. A Texas Methodist minister of the 1920s who was warned that if he preached against a local lynching, he would be embarking on a course of action was unsafe for him personally. Daniel Williams said this: the vast majority of white ministers chose to remain silent rather than risk upsetting their congregations, which indicates how difficult it is for clergy to speak out against the favorite sins of their community, even when the sin might seem so obviously wrong as racially motivated public killing. January 1931, only one pastor in Maryville, Missouri, dared to say anything about a local lynching that occurred that month. A white mob in a small town had taken Raymond Gunn, a black man accused of the murder and attempted rape of a local school teacher, and then chained him to the top of the schoolhouse roof, doused him with gasoline, and burned him for 11 minutes, destroying the school in a conflagration that took Gunn's life and reduced his body to ashes. Burning a man to death might have seemed horrific indeed. It received strong condemnation in newspaper editorials around the country. But when a federal council of churches surveyed ministers in the town, they found that all but one had steered clear of the matter in their sermons immediately following the lynching. One Maryville pastor devoted his sermon the next Sunday to the necessity of Christians giving evidence of the grace of God in their daily living, while another used his Sunday message to appeal for funds for international mission work. I told y'all about missionary work too. Go back and look at that video. The missionary work, missions are nothing more than a backdoor in to colonize a certain area. As an article published in the Journal of Negro History 1957 reported, some pastors began circulating a petition in the town during the week after the lynching, but the petition had nothing to do with the mob violence. Instead, it was a petition to close the town's pool halls. Another reason some white preachers would never speak against lynching, although they knew it was wrong. The great majority did not want to upset the parishioners who still believed in their tradition of white supremacy. Did you hear me say parishioners? That means the church, who still believed in white supremacy. Although these preachers knew what the Bible said, although these preachers knew what the Bible said, they still chose to ignore to satisfy tradition. What did the Messiah say about tradition? I believe that's in Matthew 23. But what does Matthew 15:3 say? But he, answering to them, said, why do you also transgress the command of Elohim because of your tradition? You see, even in one of the pictures on the screen was some of the white Christians were smiling at the lynching event. You know, we can say it was a fun time of gathering for white folks and a time of great misery for blacks. White Christians laughed at blacks being killed. How sick is that? Lynching for these participants was a Christian duty. There was no Christian creed. And of course, there's no biblical creed, but there's definitely no Christian creed either that suggests that lynching was godly work. But for many white Christians in the early 20th century, rural South, the anger they felt about alleged violations of the racial and sexual codes in their communities felt so righteous that they were sure that burning the transgressors to death was the will of God. No denominational resolution could convince them otherwise. You see, for many of these pastors in these regions, it was safe to preach against alcohol. It was safe to preach against adultery. It was safe to preach against lying or stealing. But if the pastor was to preach against lynching, they would dismiss him. You still run around here talking about you Christian this, Christian that. This is a perfect example of why the Bible commands us to have more than one teacher at every assembly. You ain't supposed to have no one teacher. I don't care what you say. You go back and listen to that video. Who is a pastor? Who is a priest? You're supposed to have multiple teachers at every gathering. Multiple teachers at every gathering. Multiple teachers at every gathering. You ain't supposed to have one up there that can be dismissed. And the Bible never said the teachers had to be the same people every week either. That's another reason why pastors were never supposed to be paid. The only people that were supposed to be paid were those who traveled to other towns to teach. And Luke chapter 10, verses 7 and 8 tells you how they were supposed to be compensated. See, when you're controlled by the dollar, it becomes very hard to teach the things that people need to hear but don't want to hear. Although history paints a picture that blacks were lynched for raping white women, of the 2,500 black lynchings from 1889 to 1918, only 415 were because of the supposed rape of a white woman. But that's what history taught us, that raping white women was the cause for the lynching. Most of those lynchings were because the great majority of blacks challenged, drum roll please, white supremacy. Many whites are notorious for saying they are not their ancestors. Well, in the book of wisdom, one of the books they removed, it says this: the ungodly will get what their evil thinking deserves. They had no regard for the one who did what was right, and instead they rose up against the Lord. Those who have contempt for wisdom and instruction will be miserable. People like this have no hope. Their work won't amount to anything. Their actions will be worthless. They will marry foolish people. Their children will be wicked. Let's read that again. Their children will be wicked. Read that one more time. Their children will be wicked. Their whole family line will be cursed. Say that again. Their whole family line will be cursed. Say that again. Their whole family line will be cursed. That's in the book of Wisdom, chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. I know we're going to overcome generational curses, but it takes a lot of effort. And 2nd Esdras, chapter 15, verse 21, says, as they have done to my chosen, my many chosen one, even to this very day, so I will do to them. They will suffer full payback. Y'all see why it was so hard for me to share this information? That's painful. That's very painful. But we're called animals. And listen to the accounts of stuff that was just 10, 11, 12 years ago. Listen to what I mentioned to you about December of last year. The anti-lynching bill last year. 120 years after it was initially proposed. Shot down each time over the years. Yes. America is our home. For now, anyway. But we shouldn't still have to live in fear of driving through certain towns. We shouldn't have to deal with that. We shouldn't. And it's really sad that we want to sit here and talk about all the advances we've made technologically, but we've made all these technological advances, but we haven't made a whole lot of moral advances. We haven't made a whole lot of integral advances. But technology has exploded. We have all these great minds, but a great many people are still lacking character, morality, and integrity. And it's sad that this is still what's dominating a lot of people's minds. You got to understand who created racism. And see, I'd be willing to have that conversation with anybody. White, black, Hispanic, Asian, it doesn't matter. Because most people in society have no clue who created racism. But most people wouldn't want to have a conversation with me because it would shatter their whole paradigm. It would shatter their entire Christian belief system. It will make them question everything that's coming from their pulpits. And I'm not saying the pulpit created racism. I'm saying the pulpit protects racism. Your white pulpits are protecting racism. Oh, they do it. Oh, and it's heavily being protected right now. Y'all just don't understand it. And like I said, with all the stuff I'm sharing, like I said, I identified as a Christian my entire life up until recently. And the more I studied, I'm like, man, there's some wicked stuff going on. But I mean, y'all heard me get a little excited throughout the course of the video. And whenever I get excited, I'm knowing I'm angered. and I'm hurting when I get excited. So whenever you hear me do video and I'm calm, when I'm talking like I'm talking now, I'm calm. I'm not triggered, so to speak. But if I get excited, I'm angered or I'm hurting. Just so you know. I'm not fussing. I'm experiencing emotions. Anger or hurt. Because I talked to my grandmother when she was living, who grew up and lived on a plantation back in northern Louisiana. I mentioned to you on another video about my cousin, great cousin, Clementine Hunter is her name. I couldn't remember her name when I did the video. Clementine Hunter was my cousin out of Louisiana who was never paid for artwork, and it was stolen by whites, and they're still profiting off of her work today. And so I have some pain because my whole mother's side of the family came through Louisiana, different parts of Louisiana. My wife's mother's side of the family came through southern Louisiana. And, you know, actually I mentioned on the very first video on this channel, Free Blacks Who Own Slaves, some of her ancestors actually owned slaves. My wife's black ancestors actually owned slaves. She knew nothing about it. It was only when I started researching to do that video that I came across and started asking, where your people live in Louisiana? And she told me, you know, she had no control over that. But, you know, it happened. And so there's a lot of slavery surrounding me and my wife's families. And, you know, the people that she knew, they never benefited from the slavery aspect. You know, because that was kept, you know, among certain members and sects of the family anyway. You know, regardless of which family you in. And it's just so much more work to do. And honestly, I don't know how much time all of us have left with everything that's transpiring right now. And so my heart feels for all of us. Those who have been on the receiving end, and those who have never saw any wrong in what their ancestors did and have benefited for centuries off of what they did. But, you know, you want to have a conversation? You know, I mean, a legitimate conversation, you know, about who started racism and all that. We can talk about it. But like I said, if you're a Christian, you're going to get some shock therapy. Because your pastors they don't even realize they're promoting racism. Most of them. But many of them will tell you, you know, God is not about a specific people. But they'll get up in their pulpits on Sunday and tell you about God's specific people. But I'm not going to ramble any longer. This video done went on longer than I thought. I didn't realize I had that many notes for this video. I mean, I got more. But I just basically cut it off here. I don't think I'll revisit this topic again after this video. I think I've given you enough information. Whereas if you want to learn more, you can go out and get it for yourself. Because like I said, the video is still coming on Christians and slavery. But y'all want to keep checking Islam. You know, former rapper Ice Cube, and the song always say, check yourself before you wreck yourself. So y'all want to keep checking Islam. And it's amazing that Islam is the only ones y'all check. But let me shut up and talk to you later. You know, if you feel there's some benefit to other people, you know, share the video, click the like button. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the channel. If you haven't got the book yet, but hey, what do I know? It is available through me or Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and other booksellers. But I'll talk to you later.